Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending where you are in the world. So, thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak at this event and for the opportunity to represent the interests of aquatic animals, which, as many of you might know, receive fairly little attention. So, I'm Wasseem Emam. I'm the founder and the director of Ethical Seafood Research. I'm also the head of research over there. I'll tell you a bit more about what ESR does in a bit, but just to give an overview of the aim of today's talk, basically what I want to do is to share some of the findings of work that we've been doing to advance the welfare of farmed fish, not all aquatic animals, but fish in particular, in two of the main countries where we're operating currently, and that would be Egypt and Kenya. So, just because I don't have too much time today, so what I will do is I'll give a high level overview of why we should care about the welfare of aquatic animals, but I will really frame my talk in the context of African ecosystems and food systems in particular. I'll talk about wild welfare issues in aquaculture more than fisheries or in ornamental species, and I definitely won't touch upon scientific experiments, even though we do have interest in that at ASR. But I'll share with attendees some of the findings from our work on aquaculture because that's where we at ESR believe we can make the most impact in reducing unnecessary aquatic animal suffering. And my hope with this talk is very much that others can benefit from some of our findings and that we can create the partnerships we need to build upon these foundations. So, what is ethical seafood research or ESR all about? We are a small team of individuals that are passionate about improving the lives of aquatic animals in Africa, but we also do work globally. So, we have a project in India on catfish pangasius that we collaborate on. Officially, we are a limited company in the UK, but we're actually transitioning to a company limited by guarantee. So, that's a non-profit, and we have a Spain office as well as, and we just opened one in Egypt earlier this year, and in Kenya we have a CLG status as well. As the name implies, a big part of our focus is on research, but we also do carry out training in the form of workshops and we do educational seminars. We also advocate for policy change where we see opportunities. So, for example, we have a project in Zanzibar, which is part of Tanzania. Uh, we're working with the Ministry of Blue Economy and Fisheries there to draft a strategy for the development of basically aquaculture that is sustainable and ethical. So Zanzibar is transitioning from farming seaweed and sea cucumbers primarily to farming finfish, and we want to set them off on the right foot, so to speak. So currently, our main active projects are Egypt, Kenya, and like I said, Zanzibar, and part of Tanzania in the west called Kigoma. In Kigoma, we are partners in a model farm in Lake Tanganyika, which is aiming to promote the farming of native species. So that's something called native species aquaculture. And our work there is trying to basically prevent the introduction of invasive species like Nile perch in Lake Victoria, which is a well-known story of environmental catastrophe, let's say. And the last thing I'll say about ESR is that we're all about collaboration. So all of our projects involve bringing different parties together, each with their own expertise, and we believe it's really the key to success and key to unlocking the obstacles to the adoption of animal welfare policies in Africa. So, why does fish welfare matter? Well, without spending too much time talking about that, I'll just emphasize that there's multiple reasons. Firstly, science has shown us beyond doubt that aquatic animals are sentient and can feel pain, and therefore we have a moral duty to improve how we treat them. Treating fish in our care in a humane way is both a moral and the right thing to do, and we at ESR obviously believe strongly in this, hence why we have the word ethical in our name. But beyond just ethical reasons, and as we've heard, in other fora, there are obviously economic reasons to treat animals in our care better, and that's because improved welfare can lead to higher yields and better product quality. And lastly, higher welfare practices in aquaculture are closely linked with the reduced ecological impact. So there are environmental reasons for caring about fish welfare too. And for food systems to be truly sustainable, they have to take into consideration animal welfare. It's not an exception, the case of aquaculture, and that's why I've put at the bottom there fish welfare equals sustainable growth of aquaculture. So, just to give a quick overview of the current state of farmed fish welfare in Africa, in terms of the African aquaculture landscape, obviously, systems are still fairly extensive compared to places like Asia, here, or Europe, or even South America. But that's actually the precise reason why we think welfare interventions can be impactful in Africa, because systems are still quite extensive, and we have a chance to intervene before things take off, in an intensive fashion. Within the continent, Egypt is by far the standout performer. It rivals even some of the world's top producing countries like China and Indonesia that are closer to uh, this area, and even Vietnam, India. Egypt is right up there with them. In fact, for tilapia, Egypt is the third largest producer, and within Africa, it's number one. Sorry, after Egypt, Nigeria is also a very big player, but they farm mostly catfish there, African catfish. Then there's countries like Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, where there's smaller volumes of production, but the sectors are growing fast and making an important contribution to food security and job creation. And as for the common welfare issues, it's the same as many other parts of the world. You see things like overcrowding, poor water quality, stressful harvesting and slaughter practices, and there's a lack of regulation that's particularly problematic, and the absence of any sort of welfare standards, as opposed to Africa, Europe, and the Americas, let's say, where you see now more standards in place and certification. In terms of cultural and economic barriers to improve fish welfare, there is generally a low level of awareness of fish sentience among key actors. So, when we've surveyed farmers, most of them do not seem to have been aware that fish are likely sentient and feel pain, and that's an obstacle that needs to be unlocked in order to adopt animal welfare policies. But then there's also the typical economic constraints. The farmers report having tight profit margins, and they always feel that maximizing production has to be the priority, which sometimes comes at the detriment of animal welfare. In the case of things like stocking densities. So let's start with our work in Egypt. Total fish production in Egypt currently stands around 2 million tons, which, for those not familiar with fisheries and aquaculture, is a very significant volume. And that's a number that's projected to continue growing fast, as you can see in the figure here on the left. The vast majority of that production comes from aquaculture. You can see that the red line for fisheries is relatively small, and most of that production is actually just the species that I mentioned now, tilapia, and that most of that production in Egypt is centered around the Nile Delta area, which you can see in the image on the top right there, and that's mostly done in ponds, like these earthen ponds that they fill with water that you can see in the image below there on the right. So, as I said, Egypt is such a big fish farming country, which is why we decided to start our work there. But that's also where I'm from originally, so it made sense from that perspective. We knew the scale of production was big, so we knew that any intervention would affect a lot of animals. But we didn't really know what might be an impactful intervention. So, what we did to begin with is to map the status quo of tilapia farming in Egypt. And thanks to a generous grant we received in early 2023, we were able to hold some very informative focus group discussions and workshops with key stakeholders in the major centers of tilapia farming in Egypt. And that's what you can see in those photos there. The aim there was to understand the state of play of current practices in Egyptian tilapia farming, and to gauge what the people who were closest to the fish know about fish welfare and how they feel about sentience. And one of the great things about these workshops was that we managed to get representatives from every part of the production chain. So that's farm owners, farm workers, feed mill operators, hatchery owners and workers, wholesale market, retailers, etc. We then complemented those workshops with an on-farm survey where we went to over 100 tilapia farms, also in the Nile Delta, and we asked the farmers specifically about their knowledge, their attitudes, and their practices around fish welfare. We also asked farmers about any health and safety measures they take and about the economic aspects of tilapia farming. One of the key findings from that survey was that very few tilapia farmers had received any training in animal welfare. And actually, one of the things we learned from the workshops is that we don't even have a good word for animal welfare in Arabic, so we had to be creative in finding ways to transmit what that concept means to farmers. However, on a more encouraging note, the vast majority of farmers we surveyed expressed an interest in learning more about fish welfare and attending training, and that's what figure 2 on the left outside there shows. So, figure 8 on the right shows how farmers perceive the importance of what we know to be basically how they these measures how important the farmers perceive them. So farmers viewed good feeding practices, high water quality, and proper handling of fish as the most important welfare practices. But they saw measures like reducing noise levels, increasing social interaction for the fish, and reducing predator threats as less important, which is interesting because it gives us an idea of what sort of welfare interventions might resonate with farmers for the next stage of our work. We also found that the welfare practices that Egyptian tilapia farmers were willing to implement corresponded quite closely with those that are generally understood by welfare researchers to be important, which is a good sign. Basically, good management can also be good welfare. So, whilst 97% of farmers agreed that water quality was somewhat or very important for fish welfare, only 60% of them were willing to implement changes to improve it, which stood out to us as an area that needed to be looked into further. Lastly, and this was quite interesting, we found that farmers that had received welfare training, which we had organized in the previous year, were significantly less likely to report high mortality in the next cycle, which strengthens the case for delivering further fish welfare training to this sector. So, to summarize the main things we learned from both these workshops and the survey, firstly, hardly anyone in attendance was familiar with the term animal welfare, let alone fish welfare. Um, we also learned that very few farmers actually monitor the quality of the water in their ponds. Very few farms keep reliable records of their management practices as well. And we learned that the way fish are harvested is likely to be highly stressful and detrimental to fish welfare. Well, she said harvested because that's a term that the industry uses, right? But at the same time, we saw a keenness to learn more about fish welfare, which was very encouraging. And we saw an interest in interest from farmers in learning how technology can be used to help farmers improve their record keeping practices. We also heard many participants express an interest in improving their water quality, both through increased monitoring and the use of water or feed-based additives. So that's, for example, probiotics. And lastly, we learned about the existence of these mobile harvest teams that go from farm to farm to carry out the harvest process. So it seemed like a good opportunity to improve the welfare of fish in a cost-effective way. I'll talk more about that in a second. So, because of the lack of record keeping and the interest in technology that was reported, we partnered with FAI Farms to roll out their tilapia welfare app to Egyptian fish farmers. FAI Farms is a UK based provider of sustainability services for the food sector for various subsectors, including poultry and aquaculture. Over the last 2 years, they developed this app, which is now available in Kenya and Egypt, and I think we can actually make it available here in Pakistan as well. I forgot to put the QR code to download it here, but you can easily just type in tilapia welfare app to Google, come right up. What this app does basically is it provides a very easy, straightforward way for farmers to assess how their fish are doing. All they do is enter some basic measurements into the app, and the app then gives a farmer a welfare score so they know how their fish are doing, and it gives them some recommendations that the things that they can do to improve their scores. So far, we've had great success with the rollout of this app. We've trained over 150 farmers in the use of the app, and we've rolled out train-the-trainer structure. So we train some people, they train others, and so on. As of today, we've completed well over 3,000 assessments, and we've engaged at least 15,000. Actually, that number is now we're actually close to we've just finished 4,000 now, which is basically 15% of the country's entire sector. That was not easy to accomplish at all. In terms of fish lives, that's basically 260 million individual tilapia that we've improved through this partnership. That's 260 million individual fish, I should have said. Sorry. And as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, because our preliminary work showed that the harvest process was particularly stressful, we felt that this was somewhere where intervention could be potentially impactful. I'll just show you a few seconds of this video here of the harvest process to explain why it's so stressful to the fish. Um, so how do I press play on the video? So in the coming month, we're going to be trialing an introduction. We're going to be trying to introduce electrical stunning technology to stun fish before they are put in ice slurries in the crates in an attempt to reduce the suffering that they experience at the end of their lives. And the aim there is to improve practices both during crowding, but also improve how fish are lifted out of the water and stunned before slaughtered. And that's a project that we just started. So I'm hoping that in the next edition of this conference, I might be able to share some more findings from that one, from that study with you. So moving on to Kenya, where things were a bit slow initially, but we've now started to build up some momentum. Kenya is in the top six or so aquaculture producing countries in Africa. Like Egypt, tilapia is the number one species being farmed, but there's also catfish, there's rainbow trout, and there's other species. One difference between Egypt and Kenya is that the cage farming sector in Kenya is much more substantial. Um, the majority of those cages are in the western riparian region around Lake Victoria, but there are also some in some of the other freshwater bodies in Kenya. One thing that's unique in Kenya is that demand for tilapia is far greater than the current supply, with an estimated gap of around 100,000 metric tons. That means that Kenya is currently dependent on imports to meet the level of demand, but it also means that there's a huge scope for aquaculture operations to increase, and the government is definitely keen to promote that as part of its drive to realize the full potential of its blue economy. So, for these reasons, we expect that Kenya can easily go on to be one of the top aquaculture producers in the continent in the coming years. And all of this means that it's an opportune time to improve farm fish welfare before the sector undergoes the rapid intensification that we expect and we've seen elsewhere. We believe that partnering with the government at this time could be a crucial way of unlocking obstacles to the adoption of animal welfare policies in Kenya. So, what we did in Kenya, which is the same as in Egypt and other places, is that we started out by carrying out a baseline survey to get understanding of the main challenges that the aquaculture sector faces there. However, in this survey, we targeted both farms and hatcheries as well as common interest groups, which is something we don't really have in Egypt, these common interest groups, I mean. So we focused on six counties in both central and eastern Kenya, ones that we felt were representative of Kenyan aquaculture, but we particularly focused on ponds as opposed to cages, which we don't really have much of in Egypt. They're not really permitted technically. You can see the six counties we surveyed on the right there. Um, in total, we surveyed 195 Garot farms, 18 hatcheries, and 29 common interest groups. Those interest groups alone represent around 753 members, so it was quite a substantial undertaking overall. Um, and that work was just completed a few months ago, so we're finalizing the report now, and I'll just go through a couple of preliminary findings. But before I do that, I was just going to highlight that there's some production system differences that are quite important, which is important to think about when you think about welfare challenges. So in Egypt, our soils are very high in clay content, so you don't have to use these pond liners that we see in the picture here on the left. Actually, what these pond liners do is they reduce the amount of substrate available, which for a species like tilapia, actually, who we know likes to burrow and make these nests, actually deprives them of a key behavioral need, and that's not in line with principles such as positive welfare, which are advocated for in other food producing sectors. Also, we don't have issues of predators in Egypt, like these birds that swoop down. So we don't use these nets that you see commonly in Kenya and other places. So I was just giving these an examples of how it's important to understand the systems when you talk about fish welfare. So just to share some quick preliminary insights from the survey we carried out. Basically, in contrast to Egypt, more farmers in Kenya had heard of animal welfare, but the majority still were not familiar with the term. The biggest issues that were reported to us were, perhaps unsurprisingly, around the cost of feed and access to reliable feed, like good quality feed. We also heard that globally, fish feed, um, you know, uh, prices were impacting local supplies, and that farmers were not sure when to harvest their fish to get the best prices. The impression that we quickly got from the survey is that the industry in Kenya is still emerging. This was evidenced by the fact that almost 60% of respondents reported having less than 5 years of experience in the sector. And vast majority of respondents did not receive any training at all on farming and did not know anything about fish welfare. So that demonstrates that there's a gap that needs to be filled. But a key thing we noted is that any educational intervention that we come up with will need to be tailored to the existing knowledge level of the participants, because most participants had quite a low level, as we saw. So even before we finished the survey, we had actually got some funding to run a workshop together with our colleagues, Africa Network for Animal Welfare and Farm Fish Welfare. We had around 20 fish farmers in attendance. We had all sorts of speakers representing government, feed industry, and other sectors, and they came to speak to farmers about the importance of better management practices. The feedback we got from the event was very positive. All the attendees asked us to organize more sessions, so that's definitely something we'll be looking to do in the coming months once we have secured funding. And just some more photos here of my colleagues delivering the excellent session on optimal feeding practices that participants were particularly pleased with. So, to conclude, basically in both Egypt and Kenya, animal welfare more generally and fish welfare more specifically were not terms that farmers were familiar with at all. This trend was the same for hatcheries and common interest groups, which tells us that there's an important gap there that needs to be filled. Moreover, most of the people that we surveyed, or the ones who had participated in our workshops, were very keen to attend further trainings on this topic, which makes the case for why training on fish welfare and aquaculture is a timely intervention. This is strengthened by the fact that even though our sample size was small, we found that the farmers that had attended one of our training sessions before were less likely to report higher mortality in that production cycle next year. And in Egypt, we found that farmers were already implementing some limited welfare measures, such as providing a balanced diet. They just weren't aware that these were aspects that fall under the umbrella of animal welfare. So part of our task, as we see it, is providing the overall picture. However, things like monitoring water quality, keeping records, and humanely slaughtering fish were all areas that need improvement. And in Kenya, the issue of a reliable feed supply came up repeatedly, so this seems to be an area where a business incentive might be more appropriate for improving this aspect of fish welfare. And I just want to end on this note by saying that all of the problems we came across and all the promising solutions we're trying have come about through the sheer power of partnerships. So we are big believers in the power of partnership. Thank you for listening.